Good afternoon, everyone. So, the next session is on building your career in open source by Mr. Navendu. He's a software engineer at Layer 5. So, let's get started. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for having me. I bet everyone is enjoying all the other sessions at Open Source India. So welcome to building your career in open source. So before we get started, I just wanted to point out that this session is for everyone, regardless of where they are in their open source career. So even if you are a newcomer or if you are a seasoned maintainer, I bet there are takeaways that you can use to build or advance your career. So let's get started with some numbers. So 80% of maintainers need help in finding and recruiting new contributors. And 92% of employers say that they find it difficult to hire open source talent. And 52% of developers want to contribute to open source, but they are not sure yet. And 33% of those don't know where to start. And 31% think they aren't skilled enough. So that brings us to the relevance of this talk today. Before we jump in, a little bit about me. I'm Navendu. I'm a software engineer at Layer5. I'm the dude over here in this picture. And I'm a maintainer of Meshery and Service Mesh Performance at Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I talk about open source stuff on my socials. So if you are interested to learn more and get more content, you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn, or even follow me on GitHub. I post a lot of stuff there. So the slides and takeaways from this session are available online. You can go to this link, navendu.me/OSI days. You can find resources and slides that were used in this session. So I wanted to start by walking through my timeline, my experience in contributing to open source. So I was a new programmer back in January 2020, and I managed to work in open source full-time by March 2021. And in January, I started to learn code full-time. I just got out of a job and I was learning to code full-time. And by March, I started open sourcing my personal projects. These were mostly mobile UI. I just open sourced everything that I built while I was learning these technologies. And by August, I was able to build and scale my first open source project. So this is a project that I was really proud of, and I managed to scale it up. So this is a project called NSFW Filter, which is a AI browser extension that blocks inappropriate images. So we also managed to get featured on Product Hunt and JavaScript Weekly, and got into #1 trending on GitHub. So this project is being actively maintained today. We have a couple of maintainers and a couple of contributors as well, and it has over 1,000 GitHub stars. And in September, I was able to talk about my project because it was featured at TensorFlow User Group India, so TFUG India Summit. So this was my first speaking experience as a software engineer. And in November, I started contributing to Meshery, which was then managed by Layer5. And in March 2021, I joined Meshery as a Linux Foundation mentee for a 3-month mentorship program. And during April, I was nominated as a maintainer of Meshery. And in May 2021, I was paying it forward as Google Summer of Code mentor at Cloud Native Computing Foundation for the Meshery project. And in June, I was also nominated as a maintainer of the Service Mesh Performance project, which is also a CNCF project. And after my internship or the mentorship at Meshery, I was offered a full-time job at Layer5. Layer5 was the original creators of the Meshery project. So I work as a full-time employee at Layer5 right now. And in September, I also started as an LFX Linux Foundation mentor for CNCF for the Service Mesh Performance project. So this is my career. So how can you take away things from this, and how can you build a career in open source? The first step that uh, that you need to do is to actually go and build a skill. This might sound quite trivial, but let me get into more detail. So it is important to build a skill and start contributing, but you have to know what you are good at first. So if you are already good at something, some valuable skill, build that particular skill. And most of you might be starting out in open source. So most of you might be working in open source during your free time. So it is important that you spend your free time based on what interests you. So keeping this in mind while building a skill is also important. And if you are not skilled in a particular area, but if you would like to work on that area, then you can also build your skill in that particular technology that you want to work on. And also note the skills that are in demand. So for example, machine learning and cloud native, uh, and big data analysis, all of these skills are highly in demand in the market these days. So there are a lot of open source projects that revolve around these skill sets and require a lot of skilled developers to come in and work. So keeping that in mind is also important. But if you are like me and have no clue what to do or have no particular skill when you are starting out, what you can do is instead of building a skill, explore stuff. So try a lot of things. That is basically what I can give you. So try a lot of things until you find what interests you. So when I started out, I was working on mobile UI. I was working in web development, both front end and back end. Then I was looking into machine learning stuff, deep learning stuff, machine learning on edge. Then I was working on cloud native stuff. So it took a lot of time for me to figure out what I wanted to work on. So follow your interest, follow what interests you, and explore things. And when you explore things, you should try to learn things by building projects. So instead of just following a particular tutorial, what you need to do is to actually go and build projects with what you have learned. That is the only way you can actually skill up, because what you learned in the tutorials won't stick unless you actually go and apply those things by building a live project. And like I mentioned before, you might be doing this on your free time. So if things are boring, then just stop doing it. But this is a two-edged sword, because if you stick into something long enough, you might find that interesting, but that is a trade-off. So you have to figure out if you really want to continue on that particular path. And the ultimate goal here is to reach a point where you know what you want to work on. So if after exploring quite a while, you will figure out what you want to work on, what your skills are, and you will basically know what you want to work on. So once you build the skills, let's look into how you can get into open source. So the first thing I would suggest newcomers do when they are looking to get into open source is to start by making your personal projects open source. So basically, what this means is if you are learning a new technology, you might be building projects around this. So basically, open source it. It doesn't matter if people don't use your project. If they use it, then well and good. But even if they don't, get into a habit of open sourcing your personal projects, whatever it might be. So if you built a UI for an application, open source it. People might find it helpful. Or if you have built a small framework or a library for working on one of your projects, open source is. Or even if you wrote a function that does a particular thing for your project, you can extract it into a library or a framework and then open source it. Other people might find it helpful. And if you take notes or if you collect resources while you are learning, so if you have a list of URLs of good tutorials, why not make it into a document and then open sourcing it? People will definitely find it helpful. The other thing you have to keep in mind is to learn your tools. So when starting with open source, it is important that you learn version control systems like Git, and tools like GitHub and or GitLab, where most of the open source projects reside. There are enough tutorials on the internet. I have collected a few of them, and you can find find that in the URL below. So you can just find it by going to the URL below. And the most important thing is to learn in public. So when you are learning something, document it, make it public, let others know you are learning things. So how do you go from here to a career in open source? So in my opinion, generally speaking, we can categorize it into three ways. So career for me is something you can do sustainably for a period of time, and you can also make money from it. So the first way is to build and scale and monetize your own open source project. So let's look into what that is. So first of all, why should you build your projects in an open source way? So uh, uh, the answer to that is basically you get more adoption. People, you will get more people to collaborate and work on your project, and your project is also transparent, which means your code is open sourced and people can look into your code, which will eventually drive more traffic and more adoption to your project. Uh, so if you are starting out, how do you start, like where, how do you get an idea to create a project? So what worked for me is to identifying a problem and solving it. This that might seem vague, but a good rule of thumb is if you are facing a particular problem, others might face it too. Even if the problem you are facing is really small or really trivial, others might face it as well. The only question, like, you will definitely have a market, but the question, or the only question that remains, is how big the market is. So that is something you can figure out by trial and error. That is a, like, since your project is open source, people can readily come and look into it and see if that fits their needs as well. And how do you scale? So if you are a new contributor, if you are an individual contributor, you might not have the funds or the big marketing teams that other big companies might have. So you can use social media, blog posts, and even talk at conferences or anything else liberally. That might drive a lot of traffic. And I have found that these platforms generate a lot of traffic to your open source project as well. And how do you make money from, it's like you built your project, it is open source, but how do you make money from an open source project? What are you selling? So there are a lot of successful open source business models which you can find linked uh, in this URL. But to give a brief idea, uh, for example, the Mozilla Foundations rely on voluntary donations to fund their project, and a project like MariaDB follows the business model of delayed open sourcing. And IBM has a lot of open source projects which follows the open core business model, which means that a part of, or the core part of their project is open sourced, and the surrounding add-ons are closed source or proprietary, and might require you to pay money to IBM to use that. And there is the ever successful Red Hat business model, where they don't actually sell code, but instead they sell professional services like support and tooling and technical assistance around that project. So you can adopt any of these business models to uh, build an open source, build a successful project and monetize it. Uh, so this might be what you came in this talk for. So how can you work for a company which builds open source uh, and get paid for it? So how do you make your first contribution? So there are enough docs about what you should do to make the contribution, but this is something that worked for me. So the first step is to find projects that you are interested in. We covered that earlier. So based on your interest, based on your skills, and based on the projects, find things that you are interested to work on, and learn the skills that are needed to contribute to the projects. It doesn't necessarily need to be code, which I will talk about in a couple of minutes. And join the community. So every open source project or every good and big open source projects will have a community of contributors and maintainers and owners of the project. So these communities might be in, let's say, Slack or Discord or any other platform. So join the community and start engaging in the community, talk with other people, join the meetings and do all those stuff. And to start contributing, there most open source projects will have a contributing guideline, which you can follow to get a walkthrough on how you can make your first contribution. So always look at documentation on how to do things and follow it. And a good way to get started, like you might feel intimidating when you look into a big code base, but the point here is to start small by grabbing a good first issue. These will be quite small issues, quite easy to fix issues, which are aimed to help newcomers understand the contribution flow and understand the code base and how to set up the project and etc. So grab a good first issue and fix it. So I mentioned non-code contributions. Non-code contributions are any contributions that doesn't involve writing code. These are more valuable than contributing code, in my opinion. I may get roasted for this, but not contributing code and making other contributions is more valuable than contributing code. So how can you do that? If you are good at writing, you can go write articles, you can go write documentation, you can go write content for social media. And if you are good at designing, what you can do is you can design artworks that will be shared in social media. You can create a design documentation, you can create a design convention or a color scheme and all those stuff. You can also work in the user interface, user experience part as well. And this is another great way to contribute to open source if you are a newcomer. So this is to test and use the project. So most often, if newcomers are testing the project, they have a high probability of discovering bugs or user experience inconsistencies compared to like a senior engineer working on that project. So test and use the project and identify any bugs and report them. Identify a new feature, or like basically test it and find areas that you can improve in the project. And if you are a seasoned contributor, or if you are a seasoned, if you have good skills in the technology area of that open source project, what you can do is mentor other people and help them make contributions. There are a lot of open source programs which you can find in the link, which connects mentors and mentees and help them make contributions as well. The other way, and a really interesting way, is to become an organizer or a community manager. So with this, what you can do is community meetings. You can organize the project, you can organize events. So by organizing project, I mean taking the role of a project manager and ensuring that the features are delivered exactly as you want, ensuring that the project follows the roadmap, ensuring that the contributors are taken care of, ensuring that the pull requests are reviewed. So become a project manager of the project. This most open source projects lack this particular thing because most people are engineers, and engineers don't like doing this. So what you can do is step up and do this stuff, become a manager and an organizer. So how do you level up from here and become a better contributor and eventually earn money from this? So you have to understand that with time, your quality and quality of the contributions will get better, and you will be able to make more contributions. What you can do is you can find more ways to contribute. So if you are involved in a project for long enough, you will definitely find a lot of areas where that needs help, that lacks manpower, that you can jump in and help out in those areas. People will notice it, and eventually you will be recognized. And like I mentioned before, become a project manager. This is another area where there is a lack of people. So become a project manager. That will definitely help you level up your career. And even if you are not a maintainer, do things that a maintainer is expected to do. So review pull request, create design documents, help other contributors, and yeah, do all the stuff that a maintainer is expected to do. And this is the key. This is, in my opinion, the key principle of open source contribution. If you learn something, pay it forward. Help newcomers by sharing your ideas, sharing your experiences, sharing your wisdom, and make sure that they don't make the same mistakes as you do. So always pay it forward. So how do you go and make money from this at this particular point? Or what you can do is get an internship. There are a lot of internship programs like Google Summer of Code, Linux Foundation mentorship program, Google Summer of Talks, Major League Hacking's mentorship program, and a lot more. So these are open source internship programs that a lot of open source projects participate, and the mentees can get paid a stipend so that they can work on it full time or part time based on their need. A lot of these programs are mentioned in the link below. And if you are a seasoned developer or a senior engineer, what you can do is you can get a full time role. So a full time role here means that you can get a job with the company that originally builds the open source project. So if you are working on a project from Red Hat, you can try to get a job at Red Hat because they already know how you work. They will you have more probability of getting hired. So this is a great question, and there's a great answer to it. So how to hire great programmers? And this answer is from Travis Oliphant. He's the creator of NumPy, SciPy, and Anaconda that has impacted at least a million developers. At least a million people use it daily as well. So how to hire great programmers? Build an open source project and get people contributing to it and hire from them. He also goes on to mention that he doesn't know any other better way to hire people. So there is definitely a room here that you can use. This is how I also got my full-time job. So yeah, most companies do this. And the final way is to get sponsored to work in open source. So what this means is uh, people will donate to your project or donate to you. So how do you get sponsored? So as an individual, you can get sponsored by the organization behind the project. So if you are working on an open source project that an organization or a company has built, what you can do is ask for funding from the organization that is behind the project. So if you are making significant contribution, the organization would be happy to make donations to you to help you work more and even work full time in those open source projects. And if you have built your own project, what you can do is you can ask for sponsorship or funding from the users of the project. So if your project has a significant user base, getting sponsorship from a percentage of those users would be a lot of funding, so you can work on the project full time. And as an organization, what you can do is you can raise money through, or you can do this as an individual as well. You can sign up on platforms like Open Collective, Patreon, and even GitHub sponsors, and get people to donate to your project. There are also open source grants from organizations and foundations like Linux Foundation and the Mozilla Foundation, uh, which will provide you funds to support your open source project. You can also even donate your projects to such organizations to get a level of funding to help sustain the project. All right, before stopping, let me give you a quick summary. So to get started in open source, first build a skill and open source all your projects while you are learning things, even if they are random notes or resources. Learn your tools, GitHub, GitLab, whatever it may. Learn your tools. Make sure that you are proficient in those tools. To get started with contributing, find projects that you are interested in. Join the community of that project, and always remember to start small. Everyone starts from somewhere, so it may take a while for you to like make significant contributions, but it is important that you start, and it is important that you start small. And don't only think about contributing code, you can also make non-code contributions that I mentioned. You can find some of these ways in the link below as well. So to become a maintainer, I only have one suggestion: do a maintainer's job, even if you are not a maintainer, and eventually you will become a maintainer. And to build and scale your own open source project, why are you doing that? Because to get more adoption, to provide a room for collaboration with a lot of contributors, and to ensure that your project is transparent and which will eventually drive adoption. And you can monetize your project by using the open source business models. And to get sponsored, you can sign up on these platforms like GitHub sponsors, Patreon, and Open Collective. You can also apply for open source grants. You might have heard the news about GitHub grants, which granted 15 Indian open source contributors a grant. And you can also donate your project to foundations or get funding from open source foundations. Uh, that will help your project, that will help you get your project as well. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can ask me later on my socials. You can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn, or leave a comment in this URL as well. All right, thank you everyone.